In this video, we are going to build the skeleton and decoration of our app. So first of all, let's create our projects folder in FiFTP. Let's go to the websites folder and create a new folder there and call it Distance Between Cities app. Okay, so inside this folder, let's create our files. So you're going to create a PHP file, call it index.php. Another file for the decoration, and let's call it styling.css. And another file for the JavaScript code, and let's call it javascript.js. So let's open these files using brackets. So Control O. And for the last one, let's just click right and open with brackets. Okay, now let's open the index file. So we're gonna go to the root directory of our file and just copy this. Okay, and now we should land in the index.php file. Okay. Alright, now since we're going to be using Bootstrap, let's get a Bootstrap template from the Bootstrap website. Let's click on Getting Started and let's get the template from there. And let's change the title to Distance Between Cities app. Okay. All right, to start, let's get a nice background picture for our website. Okay, so you can use the pixabay.com website as we've done before. And once you get your picture, you can place it in your FiFTP. Okay. So I'm just going to drag the picture in my FiFTP like that. Okay. And let's change the name of the picture to road.jpg. Okay, now if I go to the CSS file and set the background using this picture, so let's access the body element. Okay, and let's change the background using the background property. So you're going to use the URL function, and we're going to set this using the name of our picture, which is road.jpg. So let's center our picture horizontally and vertically, and let's make it fixed so that if we scroll down, it doesn't move. Okay. Now let's also set the background size to cover. Now let's link our index.php file to the styling sheet by adding a new link element. So let's give it an href, going to the CSS file, and also let's give it a relationship attribute style sheet. So let's save and refresh, and now we can see our nice background picture. Okay. Now let's add a bit more styling to the body element. So we want all the text to be white color. So let's set the color property to a white color. Okay, and also let's set the font family. So I'm going to be using Arvo. Okay, and as a fallback, let's go for serif. So this is a Google font, so we need to go to the Google Fonts website. Okay. And look for Arvo. Now let's copy the link and place it in the head element. Okay. Now let's create the title and subtitle. So we're going to place everything inside a Jumbotron. So let's create a div of class Jumbotron, and inside the Jumbotron we need a container. Okay, so it's going to be a div of class container or container fluid. I'm going to go for container fluid for full width. Okay, and then our title is going to be a heading. I'm going to go for H1, and let's copy this text, and then we're going to have a paragraph, and let's copy that text. Okay, so let's save this and refresh the page. Now you've got a heading and paragraph. Now let's add some styling. Okay, let's add a comment just before the body. So you're adding the font family there and the background image. Okay, now if we look at our index.php file, the Bootstrap template is referring to local Bootstrap folders and files. So we need to upload these to our projects folder. So we can just go to one of our previous projects where we used Bootstrap. Okay, and get the Bootstrap files from there. Okay, now if we go back to our projects folder and we refresh the page, okay, now we can see that the background of our Jumbotron is by default gray. So let's go ahead and change that. So we're going to give it a transparent background. So we're going to access it using the Jumbotron class and then change the background color to transparent. Okay, if we save and refresh, now that's better. Also, we're going to change the letter spacing. So we're going to do that for the heading. So let's access the heading by accessing the Jumbotron first and then the heading. And let's change the letter spacing to something like 2.5 pixels. Okay, that looks better. Also, let's align the heading and the paragraph. So let's access them like this and use the text align property and set it to center. Okay, and that looks good. Now we need to take out any margins, okay, so that our text is spread just like that. So we go back to the Jumbotron and set margin to 0. And now, okay, let's take out the padding, or let's set the padding to something small like 10 pixels, because the Jumbotron has got some standard padding. Okay, and now it looks better. Okay, that's exactly what we want. Alright, now let's move to the form. So we're going to create the form right after the paragraph. Okay. So our form is going to be a horizontal form. As we have covered in the Bootstrap chapter, the horizontal forms, they have both labels and inputs, allocated a certain number of columns out of the 12 columns of the Bootstrap grid system. Okay. So to create a horizontal form, we are going to create a form and give it a class form horizontal. Okay. Then each of the inputs is going to be placed inside a div with their label. So this div is going to be of class form group. Okay. So let's create the input first, and then we'll put the label just before the input. So the input is going to be placed inside a div, which will tell the number of columns that the input is going to take. So in our case, we're talking 10 columns for X small devices. Okay. So for extra small devices, we use the class column XS. Okay. And we are looking at 10 columns. Then we're going to place the input inside. So it's an input of type text. Okay, let's give it an ID, as we're going to use later in the code, and also to link it to the label. And let's place a placeholder inside the input saying origin. Okay. And finally, every input needs to be of class form control. Okay, now let's create a label for this input. So just before the div, we're going to create a label and give it a for attribute, which will link the label to the input. Okay, we're using the ID of the inputs. Also, we need to give the label a class, which will tell the number of columns occupied by the label. And we're looking at 2 columns here. So column XS2. And also the label takes a class called control label. Okay. Now let's duplicate this and create the second input and its label. So we're going to change from to and origin to destination. Okay, so let's save and refresh. Okay, so we need to place some text inside the labels so that we can see them. So the first one is going to say from, and the second one to. Now let's save and refresh. Okay, perfect. Now let's create the button. Okay, So I'm going to place the button outside the form because for some reason the Google Maps API doesn't like it when we place the button inside. Okay, so I'm going to place the button outside, and then later on in the code we're going to write some code so that when we click on the button we execute the code rather than when we submit the form. So the button, we're going to place it inside a div, and we are going to skip 2 columns and then create the button in the remaining 10 columns. So we're going to use the class column XS offset to skip 2 columns. That's going to be offset 2 for 2 columns. And then we are using the 10 remaining columns for the button. Okay. And then inside the div, we're going to place our button. We're going to use the button tag, and let's give it a few classes to style it. So we're going to use the button class. Also for this color, we're going to use button info. Okay. And also let's make it bigger. So if we save like this, that's how the button is going to look like. Well, we don't have any text at the moment. So let's place some text inside our button. Submit. Okay, so let's make it bigger using the button large class. Okay, that's better. Also, let's give it an ID that we're going to use later in the code. So let's call it submit. Otherwise, if we don't want to use an ID, we can just specify the onClick attributes, okay, using a function. So for example, we can define a function calculate route, okay, as we've done before in the activities in the Google Maps chapter. And we don't need the ID if we use that. Okay, so let's save and refresh. Okay. Now let's create the map container. Okay, so we're going to create a div of class container fluid. Okay, and then inside the container we're going to have our map container, and let's give it an ID that we're going to use later in the code, Google Map. Okay, so let's add some styling. So let's give it a width of 100%. Okay, so that we're using the full width of the page. And for the height, let's go for a fixed height of 200 pixels. Okay, like that. And let's add some margin top and bottom of 10 pixels. Okay, and for the left hand side and the right hand side, let's go for auto. And finally, let's just add a box for the output. Okay. So we're just going to create a div and give it an ID, output. Okay. So we'll come back to this later when we write the JavaScript code. Now we have finished the skeleton and decoration of our app, and we are ready to move to the logic of the app.